You know that moment when they're right there beside you, close enough that nothing physical is separating you, and yet it still feels like a distance you can't name. You try to read the room. You ask if something's wrong, and they answer with a simple, "I'm fine." But it doesn't land. Their tone is softer, flatter. Their eyes don't stay with yours for long. It's like their body showed up, but the part of them you actually connect with has quietly stepped back. And now you're sitting there pretending everything is normal, while something inside you tightens, because you can feel the shift, even if you can't explain it. And that's where the mind starts spinning. What changed? Did I do something? Why does this keep happening? If they care about me, why do I feel like I'm always guessing my place in their world? Am I asking for too much? Or am I just trying to get closeness from someone who doesn't know how to give it consistently?
That uncertainty slowly turns into self-doubt, even when nothing obvious has been said or done. Here's what most people never get told. Avoidant love can be real long before it becomes readable. It doesn't always show up as open affection, constant reassurance, or the kind of emotional availability movies make you believe is standard. Sometimes it exists in a quieter form, something indirect, almost hidden in how it expresses itself, not because the feelings aren't there, but because feeling deeply and knowing how to safely show it are two completely different things. And if you've ever found yourself confused in that space, it doesn't automatically mean you're imagining things or being too sensitive. Wanting clarity isn't neediness. Feeling unsettled by inconsistency isn't exaggeration. And distance alone doesn't always equal a lack of care. By the time you finish this, you'll start to recognize the subtle ways avoidant attachment shows up when love is actually present, why those signals are so easy to misinterpret, and how to separate emotional protection from genuine emotional absence. Because those two things can feel identical on the surface, but they come from very different places underneath. Most people are taught that love should be obvious, that if someone really cares, you shouldn't have to question it. It should feel steady, visible, and easy to read. But when someone has an avoidant attachment pattern, their nervous system often treats closeness like something intense rather than something simply comforting. So instead of love disappearing, it gets filtered through defense mechanisms that distort how it's expressed. That's where the misunderstanding begins. One person feels distance and interprets it as lack of interest. The other feels closeness and experiences it as pressure. And somewhere in between, both people start reacting to each other without fully understanding why. It becomes a cycle of confusion where intent and impact don't match. What makes this even more complicated is that avoidant individuals aren't always disconnected from their emotions. In many cases, they feel a lot internally, sometimes even more than they can manage. But when emotions feel overwhelming, the response is often to shut down rather than express. So what you see on the surface is calmness, withdrawal, or practicality, even when something much more intense is happening underneath. To their nervous system, emotional closeness can feel like overload. Not because connection is unwanted, but because it registers as something that requires more emotional capacity than they currently feel safe accessing. So they step back, shift focus, or simplify the interaction. It's not always rejection. In many cases, it's self-protection. That doesn't mean every avoidant behavior should be excused or romanticized. Being misunderstood is not the same as being mistreated, and emotional distance still has consequences for the person on the receiving end. But if you don't understand what's actually driving these patterns, you'll keep misreading them and expecting emotional responses that don't match the way that person is internally structured. And that's where the real clarity begins, not by assuming the worst, but by learning to see what's actually happening beneath the surface, instead of only reacting to what it looks like on the outside. Avoidant people often don't start by expressing love in emotional language. They express it in practical language first. Feelings like "I missed you" or "I care about you" can feel difficult for them to say directly, but care still comes out in other ways that are quieter and more functional. They might struggle with emotional vulnerability in the moment, yet still make sure your basic needs are handled without you even asking. Things like checking if you got home safely, remembering how you like your coffee after a stressful week, or noticing small details about your routine that others would overlook. Their version of love often shows up as stability, responsibility, and quiet consistency, because that feels safer than openly exposing what they feel inside. It can play out in very different ways depending on where they are emotionally. In a more disconnected state, you might open up about a hard day, and instead of comfort, you get something that feels logical or distant, like advice or correction. Something like, "Maybe you should have handled it differently," and it can feel cold in that moment. But in a more connected version, they might not say much right away. They sit with it, process it internally, and later return in a completely different way. They might bring you food, quietly take care of something you were stressed about, or handle small tasks you mentioned in passing. Then they ask, almost casually, "Are you feeling better now?" And even if it doesn't come with emotional warmth in the way you expect, there is still presence behind it. That's where frustration often builds, because what you want is emotional softness, not practical problem solving. But underneath those actions, there is usually something unspoken. It's not always that they don't feel anything. It's often that they don't yet know how to translate emotion into words in a way that feels safe or controlled for them. So instead of saying "I care," they show it by trying to reduce your stress in the only way they know how, through action. When you understand that pattern, it stops feeling like emotional indifference and starts looking more like limited emotional expression rather than absence of care. And when you see it clearly, the dynamic shifts. They are no longer just confusing or emotionally unavailable in a vague sense. They become someone trying to communicate in a language that doesn't fully match yours yet, rather than someone who simply doesn't care. Another important sign is that they allow you to see parts of themselves that are usually hidden. Avoidant individuals are often not afraid of love itself as much as they are afraid of being emotionally exposed. Their biggest internal protection is control over how much of themselves others can see. So intimacy doesn't always begin with deep conversations or emotional confessions. Sometimes it begins the moment they stop carefully managing every part of how they appear to you. Most avoidant patterns are built around self-containment, not needing too much, not revealing too much, and not depending too heavily on anyone else. Because of that, when they do show moments of fatigue, insecurity, frustration, or emotional imbalance, it is not a small thing. It is actually a significant shift. It means their internal guard is lowering, even if just slightly, and they are beginning to tolerate being seen without fully controlling the outcome. You can often notice the difference in how they respond under emotional pressure. In a more closed-off state, they might default to phrases like "I'm fine," "it's nothing," or "don't worry about it," regardless of what is actually happening. But in a more open moment, there might be small cracks in that control. They might say something like, "I don't really know what's going on with me, I've just been off lately, and it's not about you." It may sound simple on the surface, but for someone with avoidant tendencies, that level of honesty can feel extremely vulnerable. It is not about saying everything perfectly, but about allowing something real to be seen without immediately shutting it down. That is where real closeness begins to form, not through perfect emotional expression, but through gradual moments where the need to appear invulnerable starts to loosen. In those moments, there is often an internal shift happening where they are learning, even slowly, that being seen does not automatically lead to rejection or loss of control. Another subtle but important sign is how much they actually remember. Avoidant people can appear distant or distracted in real time, which often leads others to believe they are not fully present. But later, they often reveal that they absorbed far more than it seemed. They may not respond emotionally in the moment the way you expect, but they often store details quietly and bring them back later in action or conversation. They remember things you assumed went unnoticed. A difficult family situation you mentioned in passing, a date that is emotionally heavy for you every year, or even a small comment about feeling overlooked or unimportant. These things may not be addressed immediately, but they resurface later in practical or subtle ways. And while it may not feel like traditional emotional attunement, it often reflects a different form of processing, where understanding happens internally before it becomes visible externally. The disconnecting version sounds like this. You open up and say, "I've been feeling really alone lately," and instead of meeting that moment, they brush past it. Maybe they change the subject. Maybe they go quiet in a way that feels like you were speaking into empty space. And in that silence, your mind fills in the blanks, usually with doubt. But then there's the other version, the more connected one, and it shows up later in a much quieter way. They might come back and say something like, "You mentioned feeling alone the other night. I've been thinking about that." And suddenly something shifts in you, not loudly, not dramatically, but internally. Because your nervous system registers something it wasn't sure it would get. They actually held on to what you said. And that moment matters more than it seems. Because real intimacy is not only created in big emotional exchanges, it's built in small return moments, the ones where you realize your inner world didn't disappear after you shared it. It was stored, processed, and brought back to you later, even if imperfectly. When that starts happening, even in small doses, the relationship stops feeling like two people just existing side by side and slowly becomes two inner worlds, learning how to actually meet each other. Another pattern you'll notice is that avoidant people often become more emotionally clumsy the more they care. And that sounds backwards because most people assume love should make everything smoother. We're taught that if feelings are real, communication should become easier, behavior should become more consistent, and emotional connection should feel more natural over time. But with avoidant attachment, the opposite often happens first. When feelings deepen, their internal sense of risk increases. The more someone matters, the more exposed they feel. And when exposure increases, old protective instincts kick in. That's why someone can genuinely care about you and still become inconsistent right after moments of closeness. It can look like distance after a meaningful weekend, irritability after emotional intimacy, or withdrawal right after a moment that actually brought you closer. It's not always a sign that the connection disappeared. In many cases, it's a sign that it registered too strongly. Their system doesn't yet know how to stay fully open without preparing for something going wrong afterward. You can see the difference in how it plays out. The disconnecting version is when everything feels good between you, and then the next day they become colder, quieter, or less responsive, leaving you wondering if the closeness was even real. But the more connected version is still imperfect, but more honest. They might say something like, "When we get really close, I don't always know how to act afterward. I tend to pull back, and I know that can feel confusing." And that honesty changes the entire emotional weight of it. Because once you understand that this kind of clumsiness can come from attachment activation rather than lack of care, you stop automatically interpreting every shift as rejection, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as clarity about what's actually happening underneath the behavior. Because often, what's going on beneath the surface is not, "I don't care." but something closer to, I care so much that it overwhelms me. And when that has language, the dynamic stops feeling like constant emotional instability and starts feeling more like two people trying to learn how to stay regulated in closeness instead of escaping it. Another important sign is how they test whether your love feels safe to them. And this one is easy to misunderstand because it rarely shows up as obvious conflict or dramatic behavior. Most people think testing looks like arguments, jealousy, or intentional games. But avoidant testing is usually much quieter. It shows up in subtle withdrawal, delayed emotional openness, or in the way they observe your reaction when they are not at their best. It is less about creating chaos and more about checking safety. At the core of it is a belief they often carry without saying it out loud. That closeness has conditions, that if they are too needy, too imperfect, or too emotionally exposed, love will either pull away, control them, or become unsafe in some way. So instead of directly asking for reassurance, their behavior quietly asks, "Do you still stay when I'm difficult? When I'm not showing up perfectly? When I'm not easy to love?" It can sound like small, almost self-rejecting statements like, "You probably shouldn't deal with me," or "I know I can be hard sometimes." On the surface, it sounds like insecurity. But underneath it is a deeper question being tested in real time. If I am fully seen in my less comfortable moments, do you still choose me? And this is not a technique or a manipulation pattern. It is what it looks like when someone has learned to expect distance or rejection as the default outcome of closeness, and is still trying to figure out whether connection can actually survive honesty. So the healthier response isn't over-functioning, it isn't chasing, and it isn't trying to prove your value or force clarity out of panic. It's something much steadier and harder to fake. Calm, boundaried consistency, the kind of response that sounds like, "I'm here and we do need to talk about what happened, but I'm not disappearing just because this feels uncomfortable." That kind of energy doesn't escalate the dynamic, and it doesn't abandon yourself either, because that's what actually teaches emotional safety. Not pressure, not withdrawal, not emotional bargaining, but presence with structure. And when you respond like that, the entire dynamic starts to change. It stops feeling like a courtroom where someone is being judged or defended, and it slowly becomes something closer to a space where repair is even possible in the first place. Another major shift in avoidant attachment happens when they start letting you actually affect them. And this is one of the clearest signs of real emotional connection, even though most people completely miss it. People usually look for intensity as proof of love. Big emotional statements, constant reassurance, dramatic closeness, visible vulnerability. But with avoidant patterns, real attachment often shows up in something much quieter. It shows up when they stop fully blocking your emotional impact, because avoidant structure is built on self-containment. The internal rule is simple. I manage me, you manage you. So when someone begins to pause instead of shutting down instantly, when they ask a question instead of escaping the conversation, or when they soften even slightly because they can sense you are hurt, that is a real shift. It means your emotional reality is no longer bouncing off them, it's actually entering their system. The contrast is usually very clear. In a more disconnected state, you might hear things like, "You're too sensitive," or "I can't deal with this right now." It creates distance immediately. But in a more connected version, there's hesitation instead of dismissal. Something like, "I'm getting defensive, but I know you're trying to say something important, so say it again," or "I don't fully understand it yet, but I can tell it hurt you." And even though those sentences are imperfect, they carry something very different inside them. They carry contact, And that kind of contact can feel surprisingly powerful because it signals that you are no longer emotionally invisible in the relationship. Something you feel is actually being received on the other side, even if it isn't perfectly processed yet. What people don't always realize is that being emotionally affected is the beginning stage of emotional availability. Not losing oneself, not becoming overwhelmed, not collapsing into someone else's feelings, but simply having enough internal capacity to let another person's experience register without immediately shutting it down. And when that starts to happen, even in small moments, something changes in how you experience the relationship. It no longer feels like you are speaking into a closed space. It starts to feel like there is at least some response coming back that acknowledges your reality. That's when the relationship begins to shift from something that feels emotionally sealed off into something that feels more reachable. And from there, the questions you ask yourself also change. Instead of only asking, "Do they love me?" you start asking more grounded questions. Can they return after distance? Can they repair after conflict? Can they stay emotionally present long enough to actually work through discomfort instead of escaping it? Can love move beyond reaction and into something consistent enough to build on? Because at this point, it stops being about decoding every moment and starts being about clarity, not confusing silence with absence, not assuming that imperfect expression means fake emotion, and not ignoring your own emotional reality just to make sense of someone else's pattern. At the same time, this awareness also brings responsibility back to you, because understanding someone's attachment style doesn't mean abandoning your own needs in the process. You can see someone's emotional limitations clearly and still be honest about whether your nervous system can actually feel safe, stable, and connected in that environment. That's the real shift. You stop romanticizing confusion, you stop normalizing emotional uncertainty as love, and you start choosing relationships based not only on intensity, but on whether there is enough consistency, repair, and emotional availability for something real to actually grow.